My 50th birthday was the catalyst for what would be an ill-fated expedition. On what should have been a joyous day, I decided that anyone who had ever called aging a privilege must have either been too young to know any better or too old to care. I, on the other hand, cared far too greatly about the number attached to me. I had reached life's midpoint wedged between youth and decrepitude, between adolescence and the twilight years. That's supposed to be the sweet spot, isn't it? The meat of a life. I believed as much for years. I loved my 30s, didn't mind my 40s, but hitting 50 last month, that sparked a shift in my sense of self. Now, there's no real difference between 49 and 50. Deep down, I knew that. But logic was overruled by emotion. There was something rotten about seeing 50 plastered across the birthday banner my family had hung in the living room. Listen, I wasn't ungrateful for my life, for the wonderful people in it. That old adage is right. To age is a blessing. I know now that I should have just waited out that midlife crisis. I'm sure I would have quickly come to my senses and realized that I was fortunate to be getting older at all. Fortunate to have a loving family, fortunate to spend so many wonderful years with them. By wishing for more, I ended up with less. All I wish now is that I hadn't expressed my post-birthday blues to a younger colleague. I know how you feel, Nick huffed dejectedly as we ate lunch in the break room. You know, when I turned 30 last year, I realized my youth had died. Poof, game over. It took all of my willpower not to throttle the kid right there and then, but I smiled politely and nodded. What I would have given to be Nick's age. Those were the days. Back when I didn't have joints that seemed chagrined by my insistence upon a simple walk farther than a quarter mile. I'd taken my 30s for granted. Of course, ironically, I didn't see that I was taking 50 for granted too. Heavens, that boy is insufferable, isn't he? Chuckled Clarence once Nick had left the room. I grinned and nodded in agreement with the departmental director, who sat at the table next to mine. That gray-haired, bushy-mustached gentleman of roughly 70. He was one of the organization's few employees older than me, older, some teased, than the company itself. Still, Clarence had only been with us for a decade or so, yet he'd climbed the company's ranks faster than I had. In spite of his age, there was an air of life to him. Not youthfulness, I wouldn't go that far. The crow's feet, folded brow, and white hair debunked any such notion. And it wasn't even necessarily an air of vigor. Rather, Clarence simply seemed to have lived multiple lifetimes. He looked wise, experienced, ancient in the most complimentary way possible. Perhaps his use of the Queen's English had something to do with this notion. This received pronunciation certainly earned the director a few crass nicknames from employees whenever he was out of earshot. Aside from the existential crisis, did you have a pleasant birthday, Jeremy? Clarence asked. I turned to him and nodded. My wife and son threw a party. They invited my brother, sister, nieces, and nephews. It was a nice surprise, a nice do. A nice do, Clarence repeated, letting loose a smile, wry yet slight. That means nothing at the end of the day, does it? I raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon? For the niceness of life means nothing, the old man clarified. Nice, not so nice, or middling, it's all the same flavor of terrible. My best days this year don't compare to the worst days of my youth, before the aching bones and myriad of ailments. Do you see what I'm saying, Jeremy? What matters is life's duration, how many years, months, weeks, or days remain on the clock. Quantity, not quality. That's quite a cynical view, Clarence. I chuckled uncomfortably. Don't you share that cynicism, Jeremy? You said as much to Nick, replied Clarence. I shrugged. Sure, but I think it might just be a wobble. I'll be okay. Aging is a privilege, and that's what my mother used to say. And where's your mother now? Asked the director coldly. My tongue caught against my teeth, stopping me short of responding bitingly. Truthfully, I was too frightened to respond. Too chilled, not only by the callousness of my colleague's words, but the oddness of his tone. Clarence had always been a slightly strange and distant man, but he had never unnerved me before. "You need not simply settle, Jeremy," whispered my elderly colleague. "What would you say to joining me on the upcoming company trip?" "To Miami?" I asked. Clarence nodded. In an attempt to diffuse the tension, I joked, "Right, I get it. You're saying that I'm old enough to go on the big boy trips now? Is that it?" The old man got up and shuffled towards the door, patting my shoulder on the way. "January 25th, Jeremy." Now I could sit here and type about the business trip to Miami, about the clients I schmoozed to get a foothold on a higher rung of the ladder. However, this wasn't a business trip. Not for me, anyway. Clarence made that abundantly clear. "Today, Jeremy, you and I will take a boat to the island of North Bimini," he explained as I clambered into a taxi, with him and a young woman, not a colleague I knew. There were no other employees from our company, in fact. "Jeremy, I would like you to meet Layla, our tour guide." The young woman smiled at me, and I was overcome by a dreadful vibe. I started to fear that Clarence might be taking me to some less than reputable place for less than reputable activities, if you catch my drift. When the taxi dropped us off at a rickety old dock, a rickety old captain, a bearded, stocky, middle-aged man named Malik, led us to his rickety old boat. He was a local from North Bimini who Clarence had paid a sizable sum of money to ferry us there. Curiosity drove me to clamber onto the boat along with Captain Malik, Director Clarence, and this mystery girl, Layla. If I could go back, I would have stopped myself, for only when we were halfway between Fort Lauderdale and Bimini did I ask any questions. "Why are we going to this island? And why did you only bring me?" Clarence smiled. "I didn't agree to come on this trip for business, Jeremy. Every once in a blue moon, I fly to the States in search of a place. I have found it before, as a matter of fact, but it is a place that moves, so retracing one's steps would be fruitless. Fortunately, 5 days ago, Miss Layla found this hidden gem." "A moving place?" I asked incredulously. The old man took a pause, then exhaled deeply, euphorically. "A place more beautiful each time I find it. When I say its name, you will want to laugh, but you mustn't laugh, Jeremy. I wish to speak candidly, wish to speak with the utmost sincerity. Understand?" I nodded. "Right," he continued. "On the island of South Bimini, there is a historical landmark that draws tourists from all over the world, but it's all for show." "What landmark?" I asked. "The Fountain of Youth," Clarence answered. "A well in the heart of a dirt patch, a tourist trap inspired by that supposedly mythical place for which explorers long searched centuries ago. But it was never a tale of fiction at all, Jeremy. The fountain's true location simply flitted from place to place, changed so rapidly that very few men and women in history have ever found it. But I did, Jeremy. I've found it, as I said, many times." And then the old gentleman paused, observing me from the bench opposite mine with eyes narrow and accusatory, as if challenging me to laugh. But I was too befuddled to laugh, too perplexed by the lack of humor in Clarence's tone. He wasn't pulling my leg. He really did believe in the Fountain of Youth. Mocking the man wouldn't have been wise. I read as much in his unstable eyes. Instead, I took his statement as face value and offered the obvious response. "There is no Fountain of Youth, Clarence," I said. The man violently shook his head. "I have seen it with my own eyes. 10 times. I frowned, then chose my words carefully. "Listen, Clarence, I'm willing to believe that you and Layla have, at different points in your lives, stumbled across spectacular fountains, hidden gems in nature, but those bodies of water, which will have been natural, not mystical, mind you, were separate from one another. A fountain cannot physically move from place to place." "Not the kind of fountain you're picturing," Layla said. "But I understand your reservations. I was doubtful too until I saw it for myself. I spent 8 years searching." "8 years? Since you were a child?" I inwardly quipped, scoffing at the woman who seemed to be in her mid-20s, a lost pup who, in my eyes, had no need for youth. She already possessed heaps of it. I have only found the fountain so many times because I am forever watching and listening, Jeremy, said Clarence as he pointed a finger at his eyes, then his ears. When the lovely Layla returned to the East Coast and let slip that she had found it, word got back to me. I didn't hesitate to make her an offer, of course, a better offer than anyone else made. You see, I never know when the fountain will reappear, but whenever it does, I do not squander the opportunity. I shan't miss this window, and neither shall you, Jeremy. You're both absolutely insane, I thought to myself, but I feigned a smile and nodded again. I was aware that I had no means of escape. Malik seemed to be the only sane person on the boat. I'd clocked the captain rolling his eyes as Clarence made outlandish claims of a mystical fountain with de-aging properties. I wondered how much money I'd have to thrust the locals' way to be ferried straight back to Miami. I didn't feel safe with 2 head cases on a tiny island. However, I didn't fancy challenging the authority of, essentially, my boss. Instead, I chose to challenge the validity of his story. Failing that, I planned to cross my fingers and wait for him to admit that he'd been joking. You said it's not a fountain, I started. What is it? Well, I actually said that it's not the kind of fountain you're picturing, Layla corrected. Fine, I answered. But what does that riddle mean? She opened her mouth to answer, but Clarence raised a hand, and in an eerie manner, Layla suddenly sat stiffly, buttoned her lips as if she were a ventriloquist's dummy. The young woman seemed, behind the excited eyes and beaming smile, to be afraid of the director. I didn't blame her. In fact, I was half considering swimming back to shore. Let's not spoil the surprise, Layla. Jeremy won't understand, Clarence said. He needs to see it for himself. We sat in silence for the rest of the voyage, and I watched as we neared North Bimini. The island was laden with resorts, boat-filled docks, and an ocean of trees, green, woolly, and welcoming. Yet thanks to the disconcerting man sitting opposite me, nothing about the island felt inviting to me. Clarence, Layla, and I disembarked from the boat at an isolated shore towards the north side of the island. Malik stayed behind with his boat, grunting and mumbling to himself as the rest of us trudged across sludgy mud, entering the forest ahead. I kept thinking about how uncomfortable he seemed. I had a suspicion that we weren't legally permitted to dock there. For the best part of 20 minutes, the 3 of us cut through a dense woodland in silence. I could have refused to accompany them, could have waited with the boat, but I didn't. Something other than curiosity was propelling me forwards at this point, a hungering or hankering for something just out of reach. It deepened my dread, yet there still lurked something deeper within me, an urge driven by whatever disquieting force hidden within the ground pushed me onwards. And then the 3 of us reached it. Not a glistening pool of blue twinkling under the afternoon sun. It was a hole in the dirt, 10 meters in diameter, a cave entrance inviting us into its depths, into another world below the island, perhaps below Earth itself. Remarkable, Clarence whispered, leading the way into the hole with a torch. The surprisingly spry man found purchase on a sharply sloping embankment of mud, which formed a slope from the cave's mouth to some distant floor below. When he didn't slip to his death, Layla and I followed. I watched the woman skip merrily ahead. Her sense of wonder remained intact. I didn't know what Clarence had said or done to set her on edge, but all washed away as she giddily trailed our fearless leader into the cave. After descending roughly 50 meters, the slope leveled out into the cave's floor. Ahead of us stood a cylindrical bored tunnel of rock. It looked pristine, new, youthful, I jestingly thought to myself. My instinct was to run back to the boat, but I followed Clarence and Layla through the tunnel, followed them to a dome-like cavern of mud and rock at the end of this underground world. And at the cavern's heart was, again, not a fountain, not a pool of water, but admittedly not something that made any sort of rational sense, not something that abided by the laws of nature as far as I was concerned. A small forest lived down there, somehow surviving without the sun above, though forest feels like an embellishment. This cluster of luscious trees covered a grassy mound with a diameter of about 20 meters. It felt like a teensy segment of a forest placed in that underground container of rock and soil. Clarence inhaled, then groaned orgasmically. "I feel it in the air, don't you?" Layla nodded enthusiastically. I smelt it too. The air felt fresher than any air I'd tasted since childhood, perhaps fresher than any air I'd ever tasted. Clarence took a few steps onto the grassy mound, which rose only a meter or so up to its peak. Once he'd strolled a little way away from us, the man said, "You didn't drink from the fountain?" "No," Layla replied, "but how did you know that?" "You have the stench of true youth," he called as he knelt in the center of the forest, looking at something concealed behind shrubbery. The woman laughed uncomfortably. "Thank you," Clarence whispered. "No, thank you. Jeremy, stop hiding down there. Come." I strolled up the mound past the half a dozen trees in that tiny, impossible woodland, then stopped behind the man kneeling in the mud, and when I saw it, I almost threw up in fear. In the grass, twitching near motionlessly, there lay not a fountain, but a woman. A nude woman, but it took a few moments for me to process that. Took a few moments to process that she was even human, as the crippled lady was, without a doubt, the oldest living person I had ever seen. To use that word, living, feels disingenuous. Even the oldest humans in history looked like youthful babes in comparison to this heap of flesh and bone. The woman seemed to be fighting against the very grass beneath her bare form, and near entirely decomposed rags of blue, seemingly from some ancient sundress, lay beside her wriggling form. Those clothes no longer covered her. Even her saggy strips of off-color skin barely covered her skeletal form. The woman's complexion had a green hue to it. She was sickly, not healthy, not some embodiment of youth. This fleshy fount was a cursed thing. "We have to—" I started, choking on my words. "We have to help her." Clarence laughed and shook his head. "There is no helping us. She is here to help us, Jeremy. Besides, she is almost at the end of the road. She would not survive without the forest." Then, without warning, the old man lunged forwards, like a stray hound eyeing its first meal in many moons. I screamed as I watched the director sink his teeth into the woman's teat, and I screamed twice as loudly when I realized that the woman was opening her mouth to scream, but she had no energy to do so, no breath left in her lungs. I watched helplessly as Clarence began to suckle the fountain of youth's essence, whatever essence the near corpse had left to give. As the wretched old man drained the woman, her body undulated, pumping up and down in rapid motions, and her skin clung tighter to her skeleton. After as little as 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternal nightmare to me, Clarence stopped. He came up for air with a splutter, as if reacting to something he shouldn't have ingested. As he did so, I became aware of something. The woman was no longer twitching, was no longer breathing. "As I said, the end of the road," Clarence explained to me before delicately closing her eyelids. "You have blessed me this past century, Florence." And then I gasped as I finally saw my director's face. His skin was smoother. The whites of his hair had turned more of a dull gray. He looked closer to my age. "What have you done?" I cried. "Not nearly enough," the man answered before climbing to his feet with a near spring in his step, near youthfulness. "The fount demands renewal. Every century or two its well runs dry. A new fountain must take its place." I seized clumps of my hair, eyeballing the drained corpse on the ground. "That was a person! You killed her!" Clarence laughed cruelly. "I did nothing of the sort, Jeremy. Florence died in the 19th century. When I first met her in 1897, she was already old. Well, not old, as such. Rather spent. Physically ruined. They say she was once the most beautiful woman on the East Coast." "You're a monster?" I whispered, backing away down the grass mound towards Layla, the woman who stood silently, as if lost in a trance. I wondered whether she'd even processed anything that had just happened from her fixed position below the titchy forest. "What would you have had me do, Jeremy?" asked Clarence crossly. "I wouldn't have been able to free her. I've explained this. Besides, I was simply one of many who traveled far to see her. By that time, Florence had already been the Fount for, roughly 5 years or so. She resided beneath the island of South Bimini back then, as I recall. Something horrified me about the way in which Clarence spoke of Florence, as if he were a university professor, recounting historical events in a nonchalant manner. Worse than that, he spoke of her as an object to be milked, not a person. A poor soul doomed to over a century in that underground dungeon, existing in agony as dozens or hundreds of folk drained her youth, her essence. I do wish I'd had a chance to drink some of her splendor in the early years," he continued. "She was still a pretty sight of sorts when I first met her, but the girl had already dried up quite significantly. She was no longer the belle of the ball." I hacked again. There has to be a rational. "Look at me, Jeremy," Clarence whispered, throwing his arms wide to flaunt his newly de-aged physique. "I've shaved off, about 20 years or so. If Florence had more fuel left in the tank, I would have lost more than that. I'd be younger than you by now. But fear not. It is time. Time, as I said, for the fount to have its renewal." The old man lifted a hand upwards, and Layla, as she had done on the boat, seemed to obey some unspoken command. I watched fearfully as she took strides forwards, traipsing across the green mound with a dead look in her eyes. Once Layla was standing before us in that center point of the forest, Clarence pointed his finger downwards, pointed at the bag of bones and rotten skin that had once been Florence. What followed next pushed the vomit back up to the top of my throat. Layla knelt against the grass, swiveled, then lay atop Florence's corpse. She squirmed around, letting the bones crunch and flatten beneath her body as she nestled into place. Then the hypnotized woman whispered, "Fio." And her body seemed to fix rigidly to the ground upon uttering that word, much as had been the case with Florence. It was as if Layla had signed a contract. But she hadn't. It wasn't Layla in front of me. She didn't agree to any of it. I noticed a tear trickle down her cheek, betraying the smile on her face. Clarence had done something to Layla before I even climbed into that taxi. "We will start gently," promised the director as he took the woman's wrist. He sank his teeth slowly into her flesh, as if savoring a ripe piece of fruit. The 20-something-year-old woman's perfectly smooth complexion started to crease, gaining a few lines around the eyes, and her hair began to whiten. At first she screamed for help, and I found to my horror that I could do nothing, that something was fixing me in place. Supernaturalism or fear, one of the two. And then Layla's screams started to quieten as her insides wilted and withered with age. There was something utterly terrifying about watching youth be robbed. And worse than that, it was being robbed in such an unjustly fast amount of time. I realized that Layla would never get to enjoy decades of life as I had. Above all else, I realized that I had been a fool, a short-sighted fool. Age was no curse. This was a curse. After 30 seconds spent paralyzed, I finally managed to unfix my feet from the ground, managed to break free from that place's spell. With terror and fury intermingled in my heart, I dashed forwards and swung my steel-toed boot into Clarence's face. The director, who had gained the appearance of a man in his 30s, was flung from Layla's form and sent tumbling down the grassy mound in an unconscious heap. Then I knelt down beside the new fountain of youth, tears filling my eyes, and I tried to lift her up. But she wouldn't budge. She looked so frail, yet her body was stuck so immovably to the grass below. Layla whimpered, "There is no undoing it. Only death will..." Her bloodshot eyes bulged and met mine. The withered, gray-haired woman started to nod feverishly as I shook my own head slowly. "Please," she begged. "I don't want to suffer." Layla gingerly scooped a pocket knife out of her jacket, and I took it from her gnarled, emaciated fingers. I needed a moment to think, but there came the rustle of grass from the other side of the mound. Time was of the essence. I could see that in Layla's weary face. The longer I hesitated, the sicker I felt. So I acted. With a cry of revulsion, I plunged the knife into her temple. Layla's life flitted away, not like that of a person, but a wilting flower. Her skin and bones shriveled up, joining the remnants of Florence, and both corpses began to slip between blades of grass, becoming one with the mound below. A roar of disapproval, an animalistic, aggressive grunt, sounded moments later, and it was followed by the sensation of a heavy force thumping into my body. I was pinned to the grass by Clarence, a man who possessed far greater bodily fortitude than me. I felt bumps in the grass below, felt the freshly buried bones of Layla and Florence beneath me. "You imbecile!" he snarled. "Why would you take her from us?" "I think you've had your fill of youth, old man," I wheezed as he pressed his elbow against my throat. "There's such a thing as living too long." "Only for mortals like you," whispered Clarence deliriously. "But no to worry, I'll take the last drop of youth from you, Jeremy." "I won't say the word," I promised, choking against his elbow. He laughed. "As you wish. That word is merely spoken by each fountain of youth as a binding ritual. It fixes a fount to the earth below. It extends a fount's life. I do not need you to utter the word. You are already lying in the perfect spot, my boy. Don't you feel it against your back? The forest bleeds through its heart, bleeds through you, expels your youth. And I did feel it, felt not only the bony remains beneath me, but something else, something warm and sickly, not at all as beautiful as I had initially thought. Something parasitic lay below, as well as above, something perfectly capable of fixing me to the spot without any need for uttering that fateful word. As I broadened my eyes, petrified of the fate that awaited me, the old man opened wide, revealing his pearly white fangs. "This will hurt for 100 years," he promised in a haunting whisper. He did not sink his teeth into my wrist as he had done with Layla. He plunged them into my neck. I yelled as the process began, a process quicker than words can describe. I aged at a rate no mortal thing should ever endure. I could feel the hair in my head dying, could feel the joints in my body become brittle and frail, could feel my organs hurry more quickly towards that bright light at the end of the tunnel, and all I wanted, during that horrifyingly rapid procedure, was my family. I wanted nothing more than to see them one final time, which was when I focused on my fingers, which were still wrapped around something. Layla's pocket knife. I was clutching it above the handle tightly, and the blade had cut in my palm, draining a trickle of my blood into the forest floor. With my last ounce of energy, I yelled and thrust my flimsy arm upwards before sticking the knife into Clarence's upper thigh. The man lurched backwards, falling from his position atop me with a loud wail of pain. I relished in the feeling of those awful fangs releasing from my neck and the eventual slowing of the aging process. But there was, of course, no time to dawdle. He had aged me by 10 years or so. I was weak, and he was strong, horribly strong. I took the opportunity to remove the knife. Then I began to stick it repeatedly into Clarence's side, screaming animalistically as he fell to the grass in pain, and as he bled from a dozen little holes up from his thigh to his upper torso, I could see in his eyes that I'd leveled the playing field. He was weak enough for me to pin him to the ground. I held the knife to his throat. "Say the word," I snarled, pressing the blade until it drew blood, "or die." The young man's eyes wandered weakly as he bled profusely. "No. Become the fountain," I said, "or become nothing at all. Please," he wheezed, clutching his blood-stained abdomen. "Why so afraid? I'm offering you a chance to survive," I growled, fury driven by thoughts of Layla and Florence. "You said that life is all about quantity, not quality. So say the word and you'll get to live a lot longer." Any sane person would have chosen the knife, but Clarence was barely a person. He had warped his mind and soul by spending over 100 years clinging to life, clinging to youth, and he wasn't ready to let it all end. "Theo," he groaned. Clarence's body immediately jolted downwards and glued to the grass, fixing him in place. I considered for a moment lifting the man's wrist and taking my youth back, reclaiming the decade or so that he'd stolen from me. But as I eyed the flesh, I felt it. That force below the soil, calling to me. And I knew there'd be a price. Knew that I would end up like Clarence if I were to taste even a droplet of water from the fountain of youth. I wouldn't risk it, so I clambered to my feet. "What are you doing?" the faux young man snarled, thrashing against the invisible restraints that bound him to the grass. "Drink." "No," I said. "I wouldn't want to steal your youth, Clarence, not when you've worked so hard for it. I'll let you be. You'll last longer that way." "No," whispered Clarence as his fate suddenly dawned on him. I backed down the grassy mound but kept my eyes on him. I was still terrified that the monster would clamber to his feet, rush towards me, and steal the last of my life. I only turned on my heel once I reached the tunnel's entrance. When I made it back to the surface, I dashed through the woodland and towards the shore. I was greeted by a puzzled Malik who asked for the others. I told him that he could look for them down in the cave, but I wouldn't go with him. He was on the verge of questioning me, I think, until his eyes clocked the purple finger marks on my neck, the greater number of whites on my head and lines on my face. He saw that I'd aged impossibly. He put together enough to nod his head, hurriedly untie the ropes, and swiftly set sail back to the east coast. I still hear Clarence's screams. They carried down that underground tunnel like a ghostly wind, followed me back up to the surface. I think I will hear him forever. After all, he's still down there. He moves from place to place, of course, but he is still very much alive. That fountain of flesh and bone,